Have you ever wondered if the one thing you've been desperately searching for your whole life is right in front of you, and you're just too blind to see it? We're told to trust the experts, the critics, the powerful voices who tell us what has value. But what if they're wrong? What if the greatest truths aren't found in palaces of perfection, but in the humble memories we try to forget? This is a story about what happens when a man who has everything tries to destroy a woman who has nothing but a secret that, it turns out, belongs to him. This isn't just another cooking competition. This is a battle for the soul of food itself. On one side, you have the world-renowned Chef Edward Ortiz, a brilliant, arrogant man who believes tradition is a weakness. On the other, you have Clara Brooks, a quiet contestant armed with only her late mother's recipe book and a legacy to save. The stage is set for a brutal takedown, and the title of this story tells you exactly what happens as celebrated chef slams a contestant's dish. He intends to humiliate her, to make an example of her simple, heartfelt food in front of the entire world. But then, the unthinkable happens. In a moment that will change both of their lives forever, he tastes his mom's stolen secret, and in a flash of lightning, his heart is on fire. That one bite, that one impossible flavor from a past he had buried, triggers a chain of events so powerful, so emotional, that it will unravel a decades-old mystery and expose a shocking lie. This single taste of a supposedly simple dish is the ultimate plot twist, forcing a powerful man to question everything he believes about himself, his past, and his own lonely heart. This is more than just a story about cooking. It's a heart-aching story about destiny, about how the echoes of the past can shape our future in the most surprising ways. It's a story of unexpected kindness, devastating betrayal, and ultimately, a powerful, soul-stirring redemption. You're about to witness how a single secret recipe can be both a weapon of cruelty and an instrument of salvation, igniting a most unlikely love story. Get ready, because this journey is an emotional roller coaster that will leave you breathless. We believe this story has a powerful message that needs to be heard, one that proves that the most valuable things in life aren't owned, but are felt. It's about how a taste of something stolen can lead you back to who you were always meant to be. But before we dive into this incredible story, we want to feel connected with you. Please tell us in the comments what beautiful city you're watching from right now, so we can know how far our story has reached. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what happens next, and share this with someone you think will be touched by this incredible tale. Well, here we are in the dazzling arena of culinary warfare, where reputations are forged and shattered in a single bite. The air is electric, thick with the scent of ambition and simmering sauces. In the center of it all stands the celebrated Chef Edward Ortiz, a man whose palate is as sharp as his tongue. He moves with the predatory grace of a king in his own court, his very presence demanding a level of perfection that few can ever hope to achieve in their cooking. This stage is his kingdom, and every contestant is merely a subject vying for his fleeting approval. Tonight, his cold, appraising gaze lands on Clara Brooks, a woman who seems utterly out of place amidst the chrome and chaos. She stands by her station with a quiet humility that Edward instantly mistakes for weakness. Her dish, a rustic-looking stew, sits on the pedestal like a field mouse at a lion's banquet. It's an honest plate, a simple offering in a world that screams for extravagance and foam. To Edward, it's not just underwhelming, it's an insult to the very art of gastronomy, a throwback to a time he'd rather forget. This is going to be a quick, brutal execution. He approaches her station, the camera zooming in to capture every flicker of disdain on his face. "What is this?" he asks, his voice dripping with theatrical disappointment, ensuring the entire nation can hear. He doesn't even wait for an answer, already dismissing her life's work. The silence in the studio is deafening as he picks up his fork, ready to deliver the final crushing blow. He intends to make an example of her, to show every aspiring home cook that this is a world where nostalgia gets you nowhere. Hayes about to leave this poor contestant completely humiliated. With a dramatic sigh, he takes a bite. The camera's fixed on him, anticipating a cutting remark. But the remark never comes. Instead, a jolt, a powerful and unexpected surprise, courses through him. His eyes widen. This flavor, it's impossible. It's a ghost on his tongue, a taste he hasn't experienced in decades, a melody from a life he had, long since buried. It's a forgotten lullaby, an emotional echo from his deepest past, a taste that feels both sacred and somehow stolen. He is utterly, completely shaken. The critique he had prepared dissolves into dust. His mind races, trying to place this impossible flavor. Where has he tasted this before? This isn't just a dish, it's a key, unlocking a door in his memory that has been sealed shut for what feels like a lifetime. It's a secret recipe, one he believed was lost forever, a piece of his own soul served to him by a stranger. He looks at Clara, truly looks at her for the first time, and sees not an amateur, but a mystery. A beautiful, heart-wrenching puzzle. Hayes left speechless, a state so unnatural for the great chef that a murmur ripples through the audience and his fellow judges. He quickly regains his composure, masking the storm raging within him with a curt, dismissive wave. But the damage is done. The fire in his heart has been lit, and he knows with a terrifying certainty that this is no ordinary competition. This is something far more profound, something that feels frighteningly like destiny. What is the origin of this mom's secret flavor that has turned his world upside down? You see, Clara Brooks wasn't here for the fame or the flashing lights. Her reasons ran much deeper, rooted in the very soil of her past. She was the last in a line of bakers, the keeper of a small, struggling family shop that smelled of cinnamon and fading hope. Her entry into this high-stakes cooking competition wasn't a choice born of ambition, but of desperation. It was a last-ditch effort to save her family's legacy from being swallowed by a world that had forgotten the value of simple, honest food. She wasn't just another contestant, she was a guardian of memory. Her secret weapon wasn't some fancy gadget or exotic ingredient. It was a heavy, leather-bound book, its pages softened and stained by generations of use. This was her mother's journal, a sacred text filled with more than just recipes. It held stories, tear-stained confessions, and a lifetime of love whispered into every measurement. Every page was a chapter of her life, a heart-aching testament to the woman who taught her that cooking was an act of love. This book was Clara's inheritance, her compass, and her only real hope. Shed spent countless nights poring over her mother's elegant script, internalizing every note and nuance. The book contained one recipe in particular, a dish so special it was simply called Mom's Secret Embrace. It was the ultimate comfort food, a secret recipe her mother claimed could heal any sorrow. Clara believed in its power, in its magic. She felt that if she could just make the world taste this one dish, they would understand the love she was trying to preserve. It was an emotional gamble, betting everything on a single flavor. And so, she packed her knives and her mother's book, leaving the quiet comfort of her bakery for the lion's den. She knew she was out of her depth, a rowboat in a sea of battleships. The other chefs spoke of molecular gastronomy and deconstruction, while she spoke of warmth and memory. It was a clash of worlds, and she was painfully aware of how naive she must seem to them. But the thought of her family's legacy turning to dust was a fear greater than any panel of judges, even one led by a notoriously difficult chef. She entered the studio with a silent prayer on her lips, clutching the worn book to her chest as if it were a shield. It was more than a collection of recipes, it was her mother's spirit, her guiding star in this intimidating new universe. The weight of her mission was immense, a heavy cloak of responsibility she wore with quiet grace. This wasn't just about winning a competition, it was about honoring a life and proving that the most profound flavors often come from the simplest acts of love. This was her destiny. Little did she know, her path was about to collide with a man who had spent his entire career trying to escape the very thing she was fighting to protect. A man who would see her heartfelt tribute not as a legacy, but as a weakness to be exploited. A man who, in a strange twist of fate, was inextricably linked to the very secret recipe she held so dear. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change both of their lives forever, a plot twist neither of them could ever see coming. Now let's talk about Chef Edward Ortiz. To understand the storm that was about to break, you have to understand the man holding the lightning. Edward wasn't just a judge, he was a culinary deity, a pioneer who had torn up the rulebook and redesigned the very concept of fine dining. He saw food as architecture, as science, as a cerebral exercise. His restaurants were temples of innovation, places where foams, gels, and conceptual platings reigned supreme. He was a genius, no doubt about it, but his brilliance was matched only by his staggering arrogance. He had a particular disdain for what he called the cult of nostalgia. Home cooking, in his view, was the enemy of progressive's sentimental trap that kept chefs from evolving. He believed that clinging to tradition was a sign of fear, a lack of imagination. To him, a grandmother's recipe was a quaint artifact, something to be studied and deconstructed, but certainly not revered. So when Clara Brooks walked onto his stage with her story of family and legacy, he saw not a compelling contestant, but a relic from a bygone era he was actively trying to erase. From the moment he laid eyes on her, his mind was made up. He saw her earnestness as amateurism, her quiet passion as a lack of competitive fire. While others might have found her story heart-aching, Edward found it irritatingly sentimental. He was here to discover the future of food, not to take a trip down someone else's memory lane. He dismissed her with a single sweeping internal judgment, long before she had even finished plating her first dish. Clara Brooks, in his esteemed opinion, did not belong here. He made no effort to hide his contempt, his critiques of other contestants, often containing veiled jabs at the simplistic and uninspired nature of homestyle food. He was setting a tone, making it clear that this competition would reward bold, forward-thinking chefs, not sentimental storytellers. He was building a wall between his world of avant-garde cuisine and her world of rustic tradition. For Edward, this was more than a competition, it was a crusade to uphold his own culinary philosophy. His fellow judges, often intimidated by his fierce intellect and sharp tongue, rarely challenged him. They watched as he circled the contestant stations, his presence alone enough to make even the most seasoned professionals tremble. He was the gatekeeper, the ultimate arbiter of taste, and he was about to bring his full dismissive weight to bear on the one contestant who represented everything he scorned. The air crackled with tension every time he drew near Clara's station. He saw her reliance on her mother's old book not as a tribute, but as a crutch, an inability to create something new, something his own. He was completely oblivious to the fact that the secret recipe hidden within those pages was a thread connected directly to his own past. He was about to judge not just a dish, but a memory he didn't even know he had lost. The stage was set for an act of unintentional, but devastating, cruelty. The moment of judgment arrived like a guillotine. Clara presented her dish, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. It was a piece of her soul on a plate, a tangible expression of her mother's love. She watched as Edward Ortiz approached, his face a mask of bored indifference. He circled the plate, not with the curiosity of a judge, but with the condescending air of a biologist examining a common specimen. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, before he finally spoke, his words laced with a casual cruelty that cut deeper than any knife. "Honestly, what is this?" he began, his voice booming through the studio. "Did you get lost on your way to a church potluck?" He didn't taste it at first. He simply condemned it with his eyes, dissecting its simplicity, its lack of flair, its unapologetic honesty. He used it as a lecture, a cautionary tale for the other contestants about the perils of sentimental cooking. Each word was a calculated blow, designed to dismantle not just the dish, but the philosophy behind it, leaving Clara utterly and publicly humiliated. She stood there, frozen under the glare of the studio lights, the world shrinking to the space between her and the imperious chef. She could feel millions of eyes on her, feel their pity and their secondhand embarrassment. Her dream, which had seemed so vibrant just moments before, was crumbling into ash. It was a deeply emotional and shattering experience. Through the blur of her tears, she caught a glimpse of another contestant, a fiercely ambitious woman named Isabel, watching the entire exchange with a small, triumphant smirk on her face. That smirk was almost worse than Edward's words. It was the confirmation that this was a battlefield, and she had just become the first casualty. Isabel saw her as a stepping stone, an easy target to be eliminated. The cruelty of the chef was one thing, but the cold opportunism of a fellow competitor was another. Clara felt a profound sense of isolation, of being a lamb in a den of wolves. Her hope began to curdle into a quiet despair as the reality of her situation came crashing down around her. Edward finally took that perfunctory, dismissive bite, the one that triggered the confusing jolt of memory we saw earlier. But in that public moment, he quickly suppressed the surprise, burying it under another layer of scorn to save face. He waved her away with a flick of his wrist, sealing her fate. Pathetic was his final whispered verdict, just loud enough for her microphone to catch. The word echoed in the cavernous studio, a final nail in the coffin of her confidence. She returned to her station, her body moving on autopilot, her mind a maelstrom of shame and heartbreak. She had come here to honor her mother's legacy, and instead, she felt she had disgraced it. She was humiliated on a national stage, her most precious memories mocked and discarded as worthless. But what no one saw, least of all Edward, was the tiny, resilient ember of strength that still glowed within her, refusing to be extinguished by the cold winds of his arrogance. The competition clock was ticking down, a relentless tyrant in the heat of the kitchen. The pressure was mounting, and just a few stations down from the still reeling Clara, a small disaster was unfolding. Isabel, the very same contestant who had smirked at her pain, let out a frustrated gasp. Her hollandaise sauce had split, a greasy, curdled mess that spelled certain doom in this round. Panic flashed in her eyes, her carefully constructed composure was beginning to crack. For a moment, she looked truly lost. Most people, after being so publicly humiliated, would have reveled in this moment of karmic justice. They would have watched with a secret satisfaction as their tormentor's rival floundered. But Clara Brooks wasn't most people. Seeing the genuine distress on Isabel's face, she felt a pang of empathy that overrode her own hurt. She knew the sting of failure, the terror of falling short. Without a second thought, she quietly slipped over to Isabel's station, her own pain momentarily forgotten. Add a single ice cube and whisk like your life depends on it, Clara whispered, her voice steady and calm. It'll shock the emulsion back together. Isabel looked at her, stunned, suspicion warring with desperation in her eyes. Why would she help her? But with the clock ticking, she had no other choice. She did as Clara said, and like magic, the broken sauce began to transform, smoothing out into a velvety, perfect consistency. It was an act of pure, unadulterated kindness, offered with no expectation of thanks. From his perch on the judge's platform, Edward Ortiz saw the whole exchange. But he didn't see what we saw. His cynical mind processed the scene through a filter of cold, hard strategy. He didn't see an act of grace, he saw a fatal flaw. He saw a contestant helping the competition, a sign of someone who didn't have the killer instinct required to win. He misread her profound strength as pathetic weakness, a confirmation of his initial assessment that she was too soft for this world. He scoffed quietly to himself. This, he thought, is why she will never be a great chef. She lacks the ruthlessness, the singular focus on her own victory. He made a mental note of it, another piece of evidence to support his biased worldview. He was so blinded by his own philosophy of strength that he couldn't recognize its truest form when it was right in front of him. This simple act of kindness only cemented his disdain for Clara, a misunderstanding that would have profound consequences. Clara returned to her own station, unaware that her beautiful gesture had been so grossly misinterpreted. She hadn't done it for strategy or for show. She had done it because it was the right thing to do. It was who she was. She had just shown everyone her true character, a blend of resilience and compassion that was far more powerful than any complex sauce or fancy technique. A plot twist was brewing, as her quiet act of decency had just planted a seed of conflict that no one could yet see. Away from the bright lights and television cameras, in the sterile sanctuary of his own state-of-the-art kitchen, Edward Ortiz was not the culinary god he pretended to be. Here, surrounded by the finest equipment money could buy, he was haunted. Not by a failed recipe or a bad review, but by a ghost of flavor he chased in his private moments, a taste of a childhood he had meticulously walled off. It was a simple, rustic stew from his youth, a dish his mother used to make, and he, for the life of him, could not recreate it. It was a deeply emotional and private failure. Had spent countless nights trying, working from the frustratingly vague fragments of his own memory. A hint of rosemary, the texture of slow-cooked beef, the subtle sweetness of carrots, but something was always missing. An elusive, foundational element that was the very soul of the dish. Each attempt was a technical masterpiece, a perfectly executed stew that any critic would praise. But to him, they were all hollow failures. They lacked the one thing he craved, the taste of home. This was his own impossible secret recipe. This secret struggle was the source of much of his arrogance. His obsession with modern scientific cooking was in part a defense mechanism. He championed the future because he couldn't connect with his own past. He scorned nostalgic food because his own nostalgia was a source of profound frustration. That forgotten flavor represented a warmth and a comfort that had long been absent from his life, and his inability to reclaim it fueled his bitter resentment toward anyone who seemed to possess that connection effortlessly. And then Clara Brooks, a humble contestant from nowhere, had served him that ghost on a platter. The shock of tasting that familiar long-lost flavor in the competition had rattled him to his core. How was it possible? How could she possess a piece of his own past, a flavor so intimately tied to his own mother? The thought was absurd, a coincidence too wild to be believed. He tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it, but the memory of that single bite lingered, tormenting him. He pushed himself harder in his kitchen, fueled by a new, desperate urgency. He felt as if a key to his own soul was being dangled just out of his reach. But the closer he got to the technique, the further the flavor seemed to retreat. He was the most celebrated chef in the country, a man who could bend ingredients to his will, yet he was powerless to recreate a simple meal from his childhood. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow, a secret shame that chipped away at his carefully constructed facade of perfection. His frustration mounted, making him even harsher and more demanding on the set of the show. His anger was a shield, protecting the vulnerable, confused man who was lost in his own culinary past. He was a king who couldn't remember the name of his own kingdom. And he was beginning to suspect that the unassuming baker he had humiliated might just hold the map, a possibility that both terrified and infuriated him. What other secrets was she hiding in that old book? The tension in the kitchen was now thick enough to cut with a knife, and Isabel's ambition had curdled into something far more toxic. She saw Clara's quiet resilience not as an inspiration, but as a direct threat. During a particularly challenging baking round, under the chaotic cover of the bustling studio, Isabel made her move. A stumble, a mistake, and a crucial container of imported yeast, essential for Clara's brioche, was accidentally doused with salt water. It was a subtle, vicious act of sabotage, a stolen opportunity designed to cripple her. Clara discovered the sabotage with only minutes left on the clock. Panic flared in her chest, hot and sharp. Her brioche, the centerpiece of her dish, was impossible now. For a moment, she saw Isabel's smug reflection in the polished chrome of her station, and despair threatened to overwhelm her. This was it. This was how she would be eliminated, not by a lack of skill, but by a rival's treachery. It was a cruel, unfair plot twist designed to break her spirit once and for all. But then, something shifted. The memory of her mother, who had faced countless setbacks in her own small bakery, rose to the surface. "There's always a way, my love," she could almost hear her whisper. With a surge of adrenaline, Clara abandoned the brioche. Her eyes scanned her pantry, her mind racing. She grabbed a handful of cornmeal, buttermilk, and herbs. It was a huge risk, a complete deviation from her plan. She was going to make a savory, skillet-fried cornbread, a humble but delicious gamble. It was an act of pure, desperate improvisation. Her hands moved with a newfound certainty, a testament to a lifetime of cooking under pressure. She finished with seconds to spare, presenting a dish that was completely different from what she had announced. When the judges arrived, Edward Ortiz wore a look of smug satisfaction, ready to tear her apart for failing to deliver. But before he could speak, the guest judge, a legendary, kind-hearted French pastry chef, took a bite. A slow smile spread across his face. He was utterly charmed. "Magnifique!" the guest judge exclaimed, his voice filled with genuine delight. "This is not what you promised, but it is something better. It is honest, it is bold, it is full of soul." He awarded her a perfect score, a 10. The studio erupted in a wave of applause and shock. Clara had not only survived sabotage, but she had triumphed because of it. It was a stunning surprise, a moment of pure underdog victory that no one, especially Isabel, had seen coming. Edward was seething. He was speechless with fury. This was impossible. The amateur, the sentimental fool he had written off, had just outshone everyone with a dish born of desperation. He felt his control over the competition, over the narrative, slipping away. His judgment had been publicly contradicted, his authority undermined. His face was a thundercloud of rage as he watched the guest judge praise Clara's heartaching creation, making his own earlier cruelty look foolish. He was now forced to see her as a real contestant. The next challenge arrived, and Edward's foul mood lingered over the studio like a toxic fog. He was determined to find fault in whatever Clara Brooks created, to reassert his dominance and prove that her recent triumph was nothing more than a fluke. The theme was a dish that tells a story, a prompt tailor-made for Clara's style of cooking, which only irritated him further. He watched her with an eagle eye, waiting for the slightest misstep, the smallest imperfection he could latch onto and tear apart. Clara, buoyed by her recent success, decided to delve deeper into her mother's book. She chose a slow-braised lamb dish, a recipe annotated with a story about comforting her father after a long, hard day. It was a dish steeped in love and memory, the aroma alone filling her small corner of the kitchen with a sense of warmth and peace. She plated it simply, letting the food speak for itself, knowing she was inviting the chef's scorn, but feeling a quiet confidence she hadn't possessed before. The moment of tasting arrived. Edward strode to her station, his expression grim. He refused to look her in the eye, focusing all his energy on the plate before him. He picked up his fork, the weight of his prejudice heavy in his hand. He was preparing a litany of insults, a verbal onslaught to put this upstart contestant back in her place. He took a bite, his jaw tight with preconceived disdain. And then it happened again, but this time it was stronger, more vivid. It wasn't just a jolt of recognition. It was a full-blown sensory assault. The taste of the lamb, the specific blend of herbs, the way the sauce coated his tongue was a symphony of the past. Suddenly, he wasn't in a TV studio. He was a little boy, sitting at a small wooden table in a kitchen filled with sunlight. He could feel the warmth on his face, smell the faint scent of his mother's perfume. It was a powerful, overwhelmingly emotional memory, a fragment of a life he had forced himself to forget. But it was just a fragment, and he couldn't grasp the full picture. He pulled back from the plate as if he'd been burned, his eyes wide with a confusion that bordered on fear. The memory vanished as quickly as it came, leaving him disoriented and breathless. He stared at the dish, then at Clara, a torrent of unanswerable questions raging in his mind. Who was this woman? How did she have the key to his own locked-away childhood? Was this some kind of trick? A bizarre plot twist in his own life story? He felt an unnerving sense of destiny at play. He was so visibly shaken that the other judges exchanged worried glances. For the second time, Clara's cooking had disarmed him, stripping away his armor and leaving him exposed and vulnerable. He struggled to regain his composure, his mind reeling from the phantom taste of Mom's secret recipe. He couldn't praise the dish, but he couldn't condemn it either. He was trapped, silenced by a ghost from his past that this unassuming woman had somehow managed to summon. The mystery of Clara Brooks had just become an obsession. The moment the cameras stopped rolling, Edward cornered Clara in a quiet hallway, away from the prying eyes of the crew and other contestants. His face was a mask of controlled fury, his composure a thin veneer over the chaos her dish had unleashed within him. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous, "but it ends now. You've gotten lucky twice. That's all, it's a fluke." He was trying to intimidate her, to force a confession to a crime he couldn't even name. Clara, who had been expecting this confrontation, did not shrink from his anger. The fear she'd felt in the beginning had been replaced by a steady, quiet resolve. She met his gaze directly, her own eyes filled not with defiance, but with a surprising and disarming sincerity. "It's not a game, Chef," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "And it's not luck. I'm just cooking the only way I know how." Her calm dignity was a stark contrast to his barely contained rage, and it only seemed to infuriate him more. "Don't give me that sentimental nonsense," he shot back. "This is the highest level of competition. It's about precision, technique, innovation, not feelings." He gestured dismissively, as if the very concept was beneath him. He was trying to frame the argument in his world, a world where he was the undisputed king. He needed to believe his success was built on superior skill, not on something as intangible and messy as emotion. He was protecting his own carefully constructed identity. "With all due respect, Chef," Clara replied, her voice gaining a quiet strength, "I think you're wrong." The simple statement hung in the air between them, stunning him into a brief silence. "My food isn't about technique for the sake of technique," she continued, her words becoming more passionate. "It's about telling a story. It's about a feeling. It's about memory and love. It's about making someone feel home." This was the core of her philosophy, the heart-aching truth she had built her life around. Her words struck a nerve he didn't even know was exposed. Home was a loaded word for him, a concept tied to the very memory she had just resurrected. For a fleeting moment, a flicker of vulnerability crossed his face. He saw not a manipulative contestant, but a woman speaking a truth he had long ago abandoned. Her simple explanation was an unintentional indictment of his entire career, suggesting that in his pursuit of perfection, he had lost the very soul of cooking. He quickly masked his confusion with more anger, scoffing at her explanation and storming off, leaving her alone in the hallway. But her words followed him, memory and love. The phrase echoed in his mind, intertwining with the phantom flavors that still haunted his palate. He had come seeking a confrontation, and in a way, he had found one not with Clara, but with himself. And watching from the shadows, Isabel had seen the entire intense exchange, her mind already plotting how to use this strange, emotional connection to her advantage. Isabel had observed the confrontation between Edward and Clara with the purveyor, sharp, analytical eye of a predator. She didn't understand the reason for the chef's intense, almost personal reaction to Clara's food, but she didn't need to. She recognized a connection, a strange, volatile energy between them, and she knew it was a weakness she could exploit. She saw that Clara's power didn't come from her training, but from that worn, leather-bound book she protected so fiercely. That book was her heart, and Isabel decided it was time to rip it out. Her opportunity came during the frantic setup for the semifinals. The contestants were distracted, moving equipment, focused on their own preparations. Clara had left her mother's book on her station for only a moment, turning her back to retrieve something from the pantry. It was all the time Isabel needed. With the stealth of a cat, she glided over, her movements swift and precise. She wasn't just going to look, she was going to commit an act of culinary treason. She was going to steal a part of Clara's soul. Her fingers, so skilled with a piping bag and a paring knife, carefully flipped through the delicate aged pages. She was looking for something special, something that looked important. And then she saw it. A page with a simple title, Edward's Favorite, written in a flowing, familiar script. The recipe was for a rustic beef stew. It was a shocking revelation, a plot twist far beyond anything she could have imagined. This wasn't just a random connection. It was a direct named link. The secret recipe wasn't just something he remembered, it was named for him. Her heart hammered in her chest. This was it. This was the key to winning the entire competition. She could see the path to victory laid out before her. In the finale, she would recreate this dish with technical perfection. She would present the great Chef Edward Ortiz with his own long-lost childhood meal, a move so audacious, so personal, it would surely guarantee her the win. It was a cruel but brilliant plan, a checkmate move in a game only she knew she was playing. The ultimate surprise. With trembling hands, she carefully tore the page from the book. The sound of the ripping paper was like a scream in the quiet kitchen, but no one seemed to notice. She quickly folded the stolen page and slipped it into her apron pocket, her face an unreadable mask of calm. She returned to her station just as Clara came back, completely oblivious to the violation that had just occurred. The theft was complete. It was a deeply personal and devastating act of sabotage. Isabel now held the stolen key to Edward's past, and she planned to use it as a weapon in the final round. She felt no guilt, only the cold, sharp thrill of impending victory. She would replicate the dish with a precision Clara could only dream of, stripping it of its emotional context and presenting it as a feat of pure skill. She was confident that her technical mastery, combined with the shock of the familiar taste, would be an unbeatable combination. She was about to serve the chef his own heart on a silver platter. When Clara next opened her mother's book, her world tilted on its axis. The empty space where the most important page should have been was a gaping wound. The recipe for Edward's favorite, the stew that was so central to her mother's stories, was gone. Panic, cold and sickening, washed over her. She frantically searched her station, her bag, her pockets, but she knew it had been stolen. Her eyes darted across the room and met Isabel's for a fraction of a second, and in that fleeting glance, she saw a flicker of triumph. She had her answer. Her first instinct was despair. She felt violated, her mother's legacy desecrated. That recipe was her ace in the hole, the culmination of her journey, the dish she believed was her destiny to make in the finale. Without it, what did she have? How could she possibly compete against the technical brilliance of the other finalists? The feeling of being humiliated returned, not by a judge's words, but by a rival's silent, cruel theft. All the air seemed to leave the room. But as she sat there, staring at the empty binding, her grief slowly gave way to a different emotion. A quiet, defiant anger. They could steal a page, but they couldn't steal her memory. They couldn't take her mother's spirit. She realized then that her strength wasn't in one single secret recipe, but in the love that had been poured into every page of that book. The book was a guide, not a crutch. And in that moment of crisis, a new path forward became clear, a path Isabel could never have predicted. She closed the book and took a deep breath. She wasn't going to try to replicate the stolen recipe from memory. She wasn't going to play their game. Instead, she would do something even more radical, more honest. She would choose a different dish, one that wasn't about comforting a wealthy family's son, but one that spoke of her own history. She decided to make her mother's struggle soup, a simple, rustic broth with stale bread and herbs, a dish her mother created during the leanest years of trying to keep the bakery afloat. It was a dish of poverty, of resilience, of making something beautiful out of almost nothing. It was the most emotional and personal dish she could possibly make. It was a massive gamble. In a finale that demanded luxury and extravagance, she was choosing to present a bowl of soup that represented hardship. It was a quiet act of rebellion, a decision to trust her heart and her own story over any prescribed notion of what a winning dish should be. This would be her final heart-aching statement. She knew that to the judges, especially to a chef like Edward Ortiz, this could look like she was giving up, presenting a dish of defeat. But to Clara, it was the opposite. It was the bravest thing she had ever done. She was choosing to be vulnerable, to lay her family's entire history, its struggles and its triumphs, bare for the world to see. She was no longer just a contestant trying to win. She was a storyteller, and this was the most important story she had to tell. The finale was a spectacle of culinary theater. The other finalists presented towers of decadent ingredients, smoke-filled cloches, and plates that looked more like modern art than food. Then it was Clara's turn. She walked to the judges' table holding a single humble bowl of soup. There was a palpable sense of confusion in the room, a collective holding of breath. Edward Ortiz looked at the simple offering with an expression that was one part disappointment and one part "I told you so." He was ready to dismiss her once and for all. "Before you taste," Clara said, her voice surprisingly strong and clear, "I need to tell you the story of this dish." And so she did. She spoke of her mother, a single woman fighting to keep a dream alive. She described the lean times, the fear, and the uncertainty. She explained how this struggle soup wasn't a recipe of abundance, but of resilience. It was about her mother's kindness and ingenuity, her ability to create warmth and love from bread that was too stale to sell and vegetables that were past their prime. As she spoke, something profound happened. Her story was so raw, so honest, so deeply emotional that it transcended the competition. She wasn't just describing a dish, she was painting a portrait of a life, a testament to a mother's love in the face of hardship. She spoke of the loneliness her mother must have felt, the silent battles she fought every day. The entire studio was captivated, silent. This wasn't a performance, it was a confession, a heart-aching tribute from a daughter to the hero she had lost. And Edward Ortiz, the cold, arrogant chef, finally listened, really listened. As Clara spoke of her mother's hidden loneliness, of her fierce passion to create something beautiful despite her circumstances, he didn't see a weak contestant anymore. He saw a mirror. He saw his own mother, a talented cook trapped in a gilded cage, pouring all her love and frustration into her cooking. He saw his own profound, hidden loneliness, the isolation that came with his success and the wall he had built around his heart. For the first time, His cold facade didn't just crack, it began to shatter. A wave of empathy, an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, washed over him. He saw the passion in Clara's eyes, the same fire he secretly possessed, but had channeled into anger and ambition. He realized her food wasn't about sentimentality, it was about survival, about love, about the very essence of what it means to feed another human being. It was the truth he had been running from his entire life. He looked at this simple bowl of soup, and for the first time, he saw it not as a failure of imagination, but as an act of profound courage. He saw the story in the bowl. He saw a reflection of his own pain and her passion. The wall was coming down, brick by painful brick. This moment was no longer about a competition. It was about a connection, a shared understanding of loss and love that passed between two people who, on the surface, had absolutely nothing in common. A silent, burgeoning love story of shared souls was beginning. The emotional spell Clara had cast over the room was broken by the sharp, confident click of Isabel's heels. It was her turn to present her final dish. She placed it before the judges with a theatrical flourish. Under the spotlight sat a bowl of rustic beef stew, visually perfect. The vegetables were cut with geometric precision. The broth had a glossy sheen that spoke of a perfectly clarified consomme, and the aroma was intoxicating. It was, by all accounts, a masterpiece of culinary technique. "Chef Ortiz," Isabel began, her voice smooth and confident, directing her presentation entirely to him. "I've heard that you value innovation, the future of cooking. But I believe the true future lies in perfectly understanding and executing the past." She smiled, a practiced, charming expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. "So I have created for you a dish from a classic, almost forgotten regional tradition. I hope," she added, her eyes locking with his, "that it brings back a pleasant memory." The veiled insinuation was a masterful, cruel stroke. Edward looked at the stew, a knot forming in his stomach. It looked uncannily familiar, like a high-definition photograph of a dream he once had. He picked up his spoon, a sense of dread and anticipation warring within him. He took a bite. The flavor was correct. It was technically perfect. Every note was there: the rosemary, the tender beef, the sweetness of the carrots. It was the exact combination he had been fruitlessly chasing in his own kitchen for years. It was his mother's secret recipe, served to him by a stranger. He physically recoiled from the bowl, his spoon clattering against the table. A gasp rippled through the audience. The chef's legendary composure was gone, replaced by a look of raw, naked shock. He was pale, his eyes wide with disbelief and a storm of conflicting emotions. It was a surprise so profound, so jarring, that he couldn't speak. He was catapulted back to that sunlit kitchen of his youth, but the memory felt wrong. It was like hearing a beloved song played by a machine perfectly in tune, but utterly devoid of soul. He stared at Isabel, who was basking in the chaos she had created. She had done it. She had presented him with his own ghost, and the shock on his face was her trophy. How? How could she possibly know? The question hammered in his brain. The dish was a technical marvel, a flawless execution that he, as a judge, should have been praising. But it felt like a violation, a hollow echo of something sacred. It tasted like a perfectly replicated memory, but it didn't feel like one. He was visibly shaken, his mind reeling as he tried to process the impossible. He had just been served the key to his own past, but it felt cold and foreign in his hands. The foundation of his world was trembling. This brazen act by a ruthlessly ambitious contestant had thrown him into a state of profound confusion. He was completely disarmed, just as another bowl was being placed before him, Clara's humble soup, now seeming to hold a silent, knowing wisdom. In its simple depths, "Wait, I apologize. I see a small chronological error in my previous text based on your topic list." Topic 12 described Clara presenting her struggle soup, and Topic 13 described the rival presenting the stew. Topic 14 says Clara then presents her version of the stew. To maintain the chronological flow and fix this, let's adjust the narrative. Clara, after finding the page stolen, decides against the struggle soup that was her internal debate and instead decides to cook the stolen recipe from memory, from her heart, making it her own. This makes the direct comparison possible. Let's proceed with that corrected narrative for Topic 14. The room was still reeling from the shock of Isabel's dish when it was Clara's turn to present. She approached the table, not with a flourish, but with a quiet, somber grace. She placed her own bowl of stew next to Isabel's. To the untrained eye, the two dishes might have looked similar, but the differences were profound. Clara's version was less perfect, more rustic. The vegetables were lovingly, but not geometrically cut. The broth was darker, heartier. It didn't look like a dish from a 3-star restaurant. It looked like a meal made in a real kitchen. Isabel scoffed quietly. After her technical masterpiece, this looked amateurish, a pale imitation. Edward, still dazed, looked at Clara's offering with a sense of weary confusion. What was this? Was she mocking him? Presenting a lesser version of the same dish. He was on the verge of dismissing it outright, his mind still trying to process Isabel's culinary bombshell. But the other judges, intrigued by the unfolding drama, urged him to taste it. Reluctantly, he picked up a fresh spoon. He took a bite of Clara's stew, expecting nothing. And in that instant, his entire world came into focus. The flavor exploded on his palate, not as a collection of correct notes, but as a single unified chord of pure emotion. This was it. This was the taste he had been chasing. It wasn't just technically correct, it was spiritually correct. It was the missing piece, the soul, the warmth he could never replicate. Isabel had served him the photograph. Clara had served him the living, breathing memory. It was an absolutely heart-aching moment. It tasted of patience. It tasted of love. It tasted of his mother's hands. It tasted profoundly and undeniably like home. A single hot tear escaped his eye and traced a path down his cheek, a silent testament to the power of what he had just experienced. The difference between the two dishes was the difference between a clinical description of love and love itself. One was a secret recipe executed, the other was a secret recipe felt. The contrast was a revelation, a truth so powerful it was like the sun breaking through the clouds. The emotional weight of the moment was immense. He finally understood what Clara had been trying to tell him all along. It wasn't about the technique, it was about the intention. It was about memory and love. He looked at Clara, and for the first time, he saw her clearly not as a naive contestant, but as a keeper of a sacred flame, a woman who understood the true alchemy of cooking. She hadn't just made a dish, she had given him back a piece of his own heart. His mind, however, was still trapped in logic. The shock gave way to a new, terrible suspicion. The timing was too perfect. 2 contestants, 1 secret dish. One technically flawless, one emotionally perfect. How could this be? His grief and confusion, twisted by years of cynicism, found an outlet not in gratitude, but in anger. He had been played. He was convinced he was the victim of an elaborate, cruel trick. And he was about to unleash all his pain and confusion on the one person who had just given him a priceless gift. The silence in the room shattered as Edward slammed his hands on the table, rising to his feet. His face was a mask of thunderous rage, his eyes blazing with betrayal. "Theft!" he roared, his voice echoing through the stunned studio. He pointed a trembling finger at Clara, his pain and confusion coalescing into a singular venomous accusation. "This is my mother's recipe. How did you get it? You stole it. You've been playing me, playing all of us this entire time." The charge was absurd, but his anguish made it terrifyingly real. Clara flinched as if struck. After the pure, honest connection she felt in that moment of tasting, this felt like a betrayal of the highest order. To be accused of being a thief, of having stolen the one thing she held most sacred, was a pain deeper than any public humiliation. Tears welled in her eyes, her heart breaking under the weight of his furious, unjust words. She looked at him, the man whose soul she felt she had just touched, and saw only a stranger blinded by his own grief. It was an unbearable plot twist. "No," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "No, you don't understand." But he wasn't listening. He was lost in his own narrative of deception, accusing her of corporate espionage, of trying to manipulate him, to mock his past. The other judges and the audience watched, horrified, as the celebrated chef completely unraveled on national television. Isabel, meanwhile, watched with a cold, calculating satisfaction. It was all going according to plan. Clara was being humiliated one last time, and she would be disqualified. But Clara had one last piece of evidence. With trembling hands, she walked back to her station and retrieved the worn, leather-bound book. She clutched it to her chest like a shield and walked back to the judge's table, placing it gently in front of Edward. "My mother didn't steal this recipe," she said, her voice growing stronger with the power of her conviction. She opened the book to the inside cover. There, in faded ink, was a name and a date: Clara Brooks, personal cook, Ortiz residence, 1985. The entire room fell into a stunned, absolute silence. Edward stared at the inscription, the words blurring through his tears. Clara Brooks, he remembered that name. A quiet, kind young woman in his mother's kitchen. A woman who always had a gentle smile for a lonely little boy who would sneak in for scraps. A woman who left their service abruptly after his mother's passing. It all came rushing back, a flood of memories he had long since suppressed. This wasn't a story of theft. It was a story of connection, a story of destiny. He looked from the name in the book to Clara's face, and for the first time, he saw the resemblance. He saw the same kind eyes, the same gentle spirit. The truth hit him with the force of a physical blow, knocking the anger and suspicion right out of him, leaving only a profound, hollow ache of understanding. This wasn't a contestant with a stolen recipe. This was the daughter of the woman who had created it. The daughter of the woman who had shown him so much kindness as a child. With the truth hanging in the air, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Edward looked from Clara's heartbroken face to Isabel's smug one. "The page for this recipe," he said, his voice now quiet and heavy with realization. "Is it missing from your book?" Clara nodded, wiping away a tear. Edward's gaze hardened as he turned to Isabel. "You presented a perfect technical replication of a recipe you couldn't possibly have known." "How?" The question was an indictment, and under his intense, knowing stare, Isabel's composure finally crumbled. The lie was exposed. The stolen page was revealed. The ugly truth came tumbling out. Isabel's sabotage, her theft, her calculated plan to use his own past against him, it was all laid bare. The audience gasped. It was a shocking, unforgivable betrayal. But the bigger revelation came from the worn pages of the book in front of Edward. He saw his mother's notes in the margins, collaborating with her young cook. He realized the secret recipe wasn't his mother's alone. It was a creation born of a friendship between two women, a shared passion for cooking. Clara Brooks hadn't just cooked the dish, she had helped invent it. And in that moment of stunning clarity, Edward Ortiz finally understood. For years, he had been chasing a flavor, trying to replicate it with science and precision. But the secret ingredient was never an ingredient. It wasn't a technique or a forgotten herb. The secret ingredient was Eleonora's love for his mother. It was the kindness she showed a lonely boy. It was the very thing he had banished from his own kitchens and his own heart. Clara hadn't just replicated a dish, she had inherited the love that made it special. It was a truly heart-aching realization. His redemption was swift and total. He stood before the cameras, the audience, and the world, and he did the one thing no one ever expected. He apologized. He publicly honored the memory of Clara Brooks, praising her as a brilliant, unsung chef. Then, he turned to a stunned and weeping Clara. He took her hands in his eyes filled with a gratitude so profound it was almost painful. "You are an extraordinary contestant," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "but you are an even more extraordinary human being." He picked up the winner's trophy, bypassing a disgraced Isabel, and placed it in Clara's hands. "Clara Brooks," he announced, his voice ringing with absolute certainty, "you are the winner." The studio erupted. It was a surprise victory born from the most unexpected plot twist. But Edward wasn't finished. He looked directly into the camera, his voice breaking. "Your food didn't just win this contest," he said, his words directed at Clara, "but meant for the world, it saved me." It was a confession, a declaration, and a beginning. The competition had ended, but their story, a love story forged in fire, memory, and a shared past, was just starting. It was a tale of redemption, a testament to the fact that sometimes the path back to ourselves is found in the most unexpected of places, served on a simple plate, tasting of nothing more and nothing less than home. It was, and always had been, their shared destiny. And so, a story that began with an act of public humiliation ends with a moment of profound, soul-stirring redemption. What an incredible journey that was. We witnessed how a powerful, arrogant chef, lost in his own lonely world, was brought back to himself by a humble contestant who refused to let her spirit be broken. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest strength is found in our vulnerability, and the most important legacies are the ones written with love. This was never just a story about cooking, was it? It was about how a simple stolen memory, a secret recipe passed down through generations, held the power to heal the deepest wounds. It shows us that the secret ingredient we're all searching for, in our food and in our lives, is connection. It's the kindness we show to others, the love we bake into our actions, and the destiny that unfolds when we are brave enough to share our true story, no matter how humble it may seem. It's a love story that reminds us that we can find a taste of home in the most unexpected people. Now we want to hear from you. What part of this heart-aching story impacted you the most? Was it the moment of shocking betrayal when the page was stolen? Clara's quiet dignity in the face of cruelty? Or was it Edward's final emotional confession? And tell us, did you expect this ending? Or were you hoping for a different kind of plot twist? We genuinely want to know what you think, so please share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please show your support by giving this video a like and sharing it with someone who appreciates a powerful tale of redemption. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell, because we have so many more stories like this one that you won't want to miss. We invite you to explore our older videos and get lost in another journey. Thank you for being here with us. We can't wait to see you in the next one.